Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Markets, finance, guillotines, and conspiracies. Stacy, tell us more.
Well, Max, the first headline, Shama. Are the guillotines being sharpened? This is British historian Simon Schama, who is author of, remember, The Citizens, A Chronicle of the French Revolution. So he's an expert on revolutionary periods. And he says that historians will tell you there is often a time lag between the onset of economic disaster and the accumulation of social fury.
Social fury. Well, it sounds like a Vin Diesel movie. Social fury. Well, this is what The Economist magazine last year called the Social Cohesion Index, and they were trying to handicap which country was going to blow up first and people on the street rioting. And I think that they didn't predict Greece would be the first and biggest, but it looks like they are, and many more to come. What else you got?
Well, before I move on from that, he warns against relying on regressive indirect taxes, especially if levied to impress a bond market with which regular folk feel little connection. So he's saying, of course, that all these austerity measures are being introduced in order to appease the bond vigilantes, and this is not something that will be understood by the normal person on the street who's being asked to make happy these bond vigilantes.
Well, the bond vigilantes basically groups like PIMCO, which he's a money manager, so governments are tap dancing to the dictates of a private money manager. The governments have no sovereignty unto themselves. They are responding to money managers, and as we've reported on this show many times, these big money managers like PIMCO, they can very easily and often do manipulate these markets. So they're manipulating governments and their policies to make money, really, in a way you can't equate with skill so much as theft.
Well, in fact, PIMCO is in the news regarding Europe and provoking, stoking the flames by saying that U.S., Greece, Spain are in debt risk ring of fire, PIMCO says.
Right. This guy, Bill Gross, he's a real poet. Ring of fire. There's a problem with the fiat currency fractional reserve banking system, Stacy, is that you've got these larger-than-life poets on CNBC wielding $200 billion bond funds using all manner of propaganda to, the parlance in the industry is to talk their book, which means to use the megaphone of the propaganda at CNBC to make money at everyone else's expense.
The next headline regarding these very people, Marie Antoinette could fit into this crowd without missing a beat. Now, this is a quote from the co-founder of the corporate library called Nell Minow, and referring to their research into how many more perks the chief executives of these major financial firms, many of who received giant bailouts from the taxpayer. In fact, their perks increased significantly, including, for example, J.P. Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon, whose total perks increased by 19% last year.
Well, financial terrorism pays.
So you have all those situations happening. And then I turn to a headline actually from a U.S. government website, America.gov. Conspiracy theories and misinformation. Conspiracy theories exist in the realm of myth, where imaginations run wild, fears trump facts, and evidence is ignored. As a superpower, the United States is often cast as a villain in these dramas, they're saying. And they debunk all these, what they say are conspiracy theories across the board, political, geopolitical, and all this stuff. But then they have a section on economic conspiracy theories. And they say they are often based on the false but popular idea that powerful individuals, like these Marie Antoinettes we were just referring to, are motivated overwhelmingly by their desire for wealth, rather than the wide variety of human motivations we all experience. This one-dimensional, cartoonish view of human nature is at the heart of Marxist ideology, which once held hundreds of millions under its sway.
People who are critical of the U.S. and their complicity with Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, and other Wall Street banks in wholesale larceny of the American economy, according to the U.S. government's website, are Marxists.
That's what they're arguing.
Hey, U.S. government, you're a kleptocrat, and your day is changing over there in Washington, D.C., because millions and millions of folks in America are waking up to the fact that they've been completely bamboozled by you supporting financial terrorism on Wall Street?
Well, I have a few headlines here which actually directly contradict their assessment that all of these arguments against the financial kleptocrats are conspiracy theories. Headline number 1, the Fed's racket exposed. So this is from zerohedge.com, and they look at 2 letters from constituents to their senators asking about why they voted in their particular way on Ben Bernanke's reconfirmation to the Federal Reserve position. First, we have Senator Barbara Mikulski, Democrat of Maryland, and she voted to reconfirm Ben Bernanke. And her constituent was angry and wanted to know why. She says, quote, I was advised that rejecting his nomination would cause markets to nosedive. This is what she was told. Of course, the public was not told that. The senators were being threatened behind the scene. The next one is also from a Democratic senator, Senator Tom Harkin, Democrat of Iowa. He voted against Ben Bernanke, and his constituent wanted to ask him why he voted against it. He said, I have heard the concerns of many that the failure to confirm Mr. Bernanke would have damaged the financial markets and jeopardized economic recovery. I do not believe that anyone, including Mr. Bernanke, is too big to be replaced. We should not hold our economy hostage to the Wall Street threat that total economic collapse is the sure result of not doing everything they want.
Because they own these securities in their own accounts, these congresspeople, senators, and House of Representatives. That's why they're not acting in the interest of the folks who don't own shares in the financial terrorism. If Al-Qaeda went public via Goldman Sachs on Wall Street and it was trading for $140 a share on New York Stock Exchange, nobody in America would be against Al-Qaeda. Nobody in Washington would be against Al-Qaeda because its shares are listed on the exchange and they all own shares.
We're going to look at the racket. That is, a racket is a criminal conspiracy against a certain population. So as the headline suggests, this is a Federal Reserve racket. What are they warning senators against? Because Tom Harkin, presumably he owns shares. He did not vote to reconfirm Ben Bernanke despite this threat. But we're now being told that there is a threat against the American population being delivered by the Federal Reserve, who is a collection of private bankers, including J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, the very people who are increasing their perks by 20%.
So it's not a conspiracy?
It is a conspiracy.
But the U.S. government on their website is suggesting that anyone who thinks that there's a conspiracy is a Marxist. And yet here you have bold evidence that there is no conspiracy. They're financial terrorists.
And then some more evidence of potential, what the U.S. government would call a conspiracy, presenting what could be the oddest capital flow observation in history. So we all know that there's been liquidation across all asset classes in the last few weeks, except for one equity in particular, and that's SPY, which is an ETF. Bank of America points out that the number of SPY shares outstanding rose by 5.3% on Thursday and Friday of last week, meaning May 6th and 7th, at the time when the S&P was trading lower on both days, which is a bit of an understatement.
Well, look at this very carefully. The shares outstanding increased. What does that mean? That is counterfeiting. That is a theme that has been touched upon on this show repeatedly, whether it's naked short selling or increasing the shares of SPY in the exchange at the whim of those in government who are manipulating markets to affect political policy. That is legalized counterfeiting.
Well, we might also remind the audience that May 6th is the day that the Dow dove by 1,000 points, and which you have called an act of financial terrorism, which takes me to our next headline. House Committee on Homeland Security seeks cooperation from Max Keiser on financial terrorism. Well, apparently after watching this show, somebody from the House Committee on Homeland Security, Chris Beck, wrote to you and said, I have been reading and listening to you regarding the May 6th stock market plunge and the likelihood that this was an act of financial terrorism. I think this is a huge issue that has not been given enough attention and may warrant oversight by our committee. I would greatly appreciate the chance to talk to you to make sure I understand the nuts and bolts and to figure out what avenues may be available to correct what appears to be a massive fraud that could undermine U.S. national security.
Right, so the U.S. government's official website is saying anyone who calls these acts something akin to financial terrorism is a Marxist, wherein a committee in Washington is emailing me, this guy Chris Beck. He wants me to help him understand the nature of financial terrorism. Now, what I told him, and what I told Chris Beck, was that, look, Chris Beck, the U.S. government and Goldman are the same thing. If I tell you how to fight financial terrorism, all you're going to do is tell Goldman Sachs the various ideas that I have in terms of how to re-architect these markets, and then they will use that information to increase the level of financial terrorism. So I'm not going to help the enemy. I'm not going to help the enemy of the state, Goldman Sachs, by telling you how to increase the level of sophistication in these markets. I'm not going to do it. Forget it. I believe in something different than wholesale larceny in the American financial system.
Well, that's it. And apparently the viewers of this website and our program are going to come up with their own movie as a film to respond to this with who they think are the biggest financial terrorists in America.
That's right. Mike Shedlock. His viewers and bloggers are putting together a film. And also, Stacy, I want to alert you that I've commissioned some new cakes to be made in the spirit of Marie Antoinette, cakes designed in the shape of a guillotine. And then we'll present these cakes on this show and maybe give a few away as part of our guillotine cake raffle to people who want to participate in a really getting warmed up to this new reign of justice.
Or you could say that you might deliver it to 85 Broad Street and say, let them eat cake, the guillotine cake.
That, of course, being the corporate headquarters of Goldman Sachs. Okay, Stacy Herbert, thanks once again for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away, much more. Stay tuned.
One of the key elements of democracy, which is so uncomfortable for the authorities. Who pays for the news? How dependent is this independent media? And who is behind the TV stories? Georgian media, fiction and reality on RT. Welcome to the future.
We've got the gear to get you around the brake lights and blaze a trail for your friends to follow.
Katya, wave to me. Wave
Hi,
to me.
Nikki.
Revving the engines of Russia's slick new speedster and keeping the road clear. Big city life. If you don't get it, we can translate. On Technology Update.
Here on RT, we've got the future covered.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time to go to Germany and meet my guest, Dr. Jeroen Benninger, known as Dr. B. Dr. Benninger is a trend forecaster and a, quote, crisis Sherpa that advises clients on navigating economic crisis. Dr. B, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Hello, thank you for having me.
All right, Dr. B, first, we're just talking about guillotine risk. What do you think the risk is over the next 6 months of, quote, social fury in Europe over these austerity measures designed to appease the bond vigilantes?
Yeah, I think the big issue is, if you look at what really happening here is, it's very similar to what the UK has done and what the US has done already for a couple of years. So we just started to do quantitative easing. And so now the big concern is really, will the Eurozone break up or not? So that is the only difference to the UK or to the United States, basically. We have California, which is bankrupt. We have Greece, which is bankrupt. Today we learned that Spain was bankrupt and France was bankrupt around the 7th to the 10th of May. And only these bailout packages and the quantitative easing made the bond markets working again.
All right, let's just follow up on that for a second. You mentioned that France says they're bankrupt. Speak on that a little bit.
Well, actually, we had that very interesting meeting where Nicolas Sarkozy was convincing Angela Merkel to put up that bailout funds. And two countries beside Greece were bankrupt. They couldn't refinance at the markets anymore. So we know that especially the French banking system has about 700 billion euros exposure to the Greek debt. And if that would have been imploded without a bailout package, then the French banking system would have been bankrupt. And at that moment of time, at around the 11th of May, France couldn't refinance in the normal markets anymore because everybody expected that the default will happen, and then it will take down the French banking system, and along with it, through the guarantees, the French government, basically. And the same happened to Spain as well around the 7th. So two countries were really in a technical default mode. I think Spain had something like 18% interest rate on its debt. So basically technical default.
So technically we're talking about a backdoor bailout of France. All right, let's move on. Quantitative easing, just for those who are joining the global crisis late in the game, it's the same thing as monetizing your debt, right?
Yeah, basically, yes. It's distorting the markets and giving the government more debt, giving the government the money to distribute it to some people.
Okay, so it's a little bit like a dog eating its own vomit. Next, let's go over some of the other predictions you make for the next 6 months. You recently posted on your blog. Your first and second predictions are related. You see the EU preparing for a Greek insolvency and consequently a haircut to Greek bonds, and Greece leaving the Eurozone. Please comment.
Well, yeah, I think there is no other way for Greece to survive. You're basically now here in the Eurozone in a full-blown Argentina scenario where we had the Argentina default. There's a lot of social unrest and all the consequences from that. And so that's basically the scenario I see the Eurozone in, despite the fact that the Eurozone should be not so in a bad shape as a lot of people comment. But I think the social component is really the issue. And this causing more deflation in Greece, I think you're putting a lot of pressure on the very poor people, on the citizens out there. And if you look what happens currently in the world, it's the farmers, for example. It's usually the farmers who are now going on the street and doing a kind of revolution. And I think that's very interesting. We see that in Thailand. We see that partly in Greece and in other countries. And so you cannot survive by causing more deflation. I think the countries need to go into an inflation mode. And I think that is very difficult in the Eurozone with the framework we have. And today, basically, they signed off for this bailout package here in Germany, and it seems like there are some parts in it which basically promote that Greece might leave. So there are two cases in which this bailout package can be dissolved, and one is if one of those countries which needs the money is leaving the Eurozone.
If Greece defaults, won't it be German taxpayers that lose the most? And with that, there are many rumors that Germany will leave the euro. Your thoughts?
Well, there's lots of rumors, and I think we were very close last weekend to have basically a corralito, like in Argentina, basically a full-blown stop of the banking system if the bailout wouldn't have come through. So Germany is putting money in just to keep the banking system alive. And I think at a certain point of time, Germany or Greece has to pull out if this continues. The big player here, the big part, what is going to happen in the future, the big question here is, how does China play the game? Today, I think we have heard, at least the news reported, that the Chinese central bank might want to support the euro, and then we have a chance to survive eventually. But currently, we see a lot of capital flight happening. More than 9 billion euros went to Switzerland. Citizens went just over the border and put their money there during the last week. And I think that is a growing concern for everybody.
Now, you mentioned just a moment ago that the solution in this deflationary debt spiral would be to add inflation. Now, the countries around the world, whether it's the UK, the US, or the Eurozone, they would love to add inflation. And they've been printing money like crazy. And they're engaged in quantitative easing or monetizing their own debt by printing more money. And yet, we don't see any inflation because the banking system is hoarding massive amounts, hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars worth of debts that they still haven't even disclosed. And every time, and of course, it's to the benefit of the banks who love deflation and low interest rates because it helps their speculative bets, and they never have to pay any of their losers, and it's a way to socialize all the losses. So at what point will the banks finally finish disclosing all of the debts on their balance sheets? Will that point ever come, or are we basically in the world subject to this financial terrorism with no end?
Well, I think we're getting closer to the end because we see now Spain under pressure. We saw a Spanish bank failing again. the second Spanish bank during this crisis. That doesn't sound much, but now the concern is how does the Spanish government, which has to basically do this austerity measures and save money, how do they handle a situation that they have to put money in the banking system? And I think that is really the big issue we're facing now. On one side, you have to support the banking system to keep it alive. On the other side, basically everything is falling apart and you need to save money. So that is a big question.
Right. Of course, in a fractional reserve fiat currency system like you have around the world, you're not actually talking about adding more money. You're simply saying adding more debt and reducing the reserve requirements on the bank's balance sheets and making the situation catastrophically worse by simply avoiding the natural course of an economy in a deflationary spiral after decades of excess. Now, another prediction you make for the next 6 months is that this deflationary nightmare will hit the U.S. The U.S., of course, has been insulated because it's got the world reserve currency and it's got the Pentagon to go out there and bomb folks anytime they need a bit of an economic boost. Most are focused on debt in Europe and bubbles in China at the moment, but you see the U.S. is where the next shock will emerge. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's quite clear. All these attacks on the euro were basically initiated in the United States, so it's basically diversion tactics from what is currently happening in the United States. And we see lots of problems. We see the oil spill. We see there's no problem has been solved. We see more and more bank failures. And according to my theories, if central banks do quantitative easing, they cause primarily deflation. So they put more and more people out in unemployment. They get them out of the jobs, they destroy the economy, and I basically can more or less prove that somehow. And so the first step is basically to create more deflation, and that is basically very bad for the economy. And as the United States, the only buyer for the treasury bonds is basically the Fed. So you have to monetize more of those debt and causing more deflation until a certain point where you just do a small switch and then you cause inflation.
Right, and that small switch, of course, is not merely inflation, but you have a currency collapse, which is tantamount to hyperinflation. And in that scenario, I would imagine pretty much every fiat currency around the world is toast.
Yeah, everything is based on the US dollar, and I don't think they have a solution to handle that. And if you look at how the US dollar has been managed, so part of managing the US dollar and the reserve currency standard is to having more than 800 military bases all over the planet. And the big question is, how do you support your military if your currency is devaluating at a rapid speed? At a certain point of time, that is not possible anymore. And then the whole system breaks down.
Now, China, speaking of China, is decoupling and does not require exports to sustain growth, end quote. You are saying. Now, most are saying that China faces the mother of all collapses, but you see China's economy as sustainable. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I look at different things. I look at something like efficiency. You know, one of the most rigged parameters, which usually the United States is using, is productivity. And productivity means just that, according to the theories, if you have GDP growth and your people are just working less hours, because there's no work anymore, then basically you have a productivity increase. That's currently what is happening. So you have this fantastic productivity increases in the United States, which are only there because people are waiting for orders. And as those orders don't come, you will have a drop in productivity. The opposite is true for China. And I think the economy, of course, will have a lot of problems. But if you understand Chinese history, you're looking back what China has done. They always have opened to the West and then closed again. And I think they might become self-sufficient, of course, with a lot of pain. But I think we would suffer much more from that than the Chinese.
Are the Chinese gaming the system?
Well, they are very intelligent managing their country. I think they don't care about the West. That's it. They care about their country and their interests, and I think they're doing that very intelligent.
So at if it was appropriate, the Chinese would simply drop America like a hot rock and move on.
I don't think they will drop it immediately, but they don't care. So they want to sustain the relationships and benefit from it as best as possible. And at a certain point of time, they will use it to their advantage. That is what you refer to dropping, basically.
All right, Dr. B, thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you.
Okay, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report. I want to thank my guest, Stacy Herbert, and Dr. Jörn Berninger. And if you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.